Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever wondered about the why behind biblical rules on sex? It's way more than just a list of do's and don'ts. Today, we're going to unpack the deep theological ideas that shape the entire framework. Let's get right into it. So, the big question is, what's holding all this together? We're not just going to go through a list of rules. We're digging deeper for the core principles that give all of those rules their meaning in the first place. And it really all boils down to two main pillars. On one hand, you have the covenant. Think of this as a sacred, unbreakable promise, and marriage is its ultimate symbol. And on the other hand, you have sanctification. Now, this is the idea of setting something apart as holy. In this case, the body itself, dedicating it to God. Keep these two concepts in your back pocket because they're going to guide us through everything else. So here's our roadmap. We'll look at what it means to break that sacred covenant. Then we'll explore the really powerful idea of the body as a temple. After that, we're going inside the mind to understand this so-called battle against lust. Then we'll touch on the theology of design. And finally, we'll wrap up with what the text calls the cycle of impurity. Okay, first up, breaking that sacred covenant. And we're going to zero in on adultery, which in this framework is seen as the absolute ultimate betrayal of that vow we just talked about. So what exactly is adultery in this context? Well, it's viewed as way more than just a physical act. It's a violation of a promise that is both legal and spiritual. And what's really fascinating is how the Bible uses this idea as a metaphor for spiritual adultery, which is when people turn away from God. This gives the whole concept a much, much deeper spiritual weight. If you look at the Old Testament, the concern here was very public, very communal. Adultery wasn't just a private sin. It was a genuine threat to the stability of the family and, by extension, the whole community. It messed with lineage and inheritance, so the consequences were often incredibly severe and public.
But then, when we get to the New Testament, there's this radical shift. Jesus completely turns the focus inward. Suddenly, it's not just about the physical act anymore. The real battleground? It's the heart. It's about your intentions, what he called the lingering gaze.
And this quote right here, from the Sermon on the Mount, just drives that point home. Jesus completely raises the stakes. He's saying that the thought, that internal desire, is just as significant as the action. The moral line is drawn way, way back at the first spark of desire, not at the act itself. So, that focus on the internal brings us right to our second big idea, the body as a temple. This is where that concept of sanctification, setting something apart as sacred, really comes to life. Now, to really get this, you gotta know one key Greek word, porneia. And yeah, you can probably hear our modern word pornography right in there. It was kind of a catch-all term for sexual immorality, but its core meaning is about the misuse of the body, treating it in a way it wasn't intended to be treated. The Apostle Paul really takes this idea and runs with it. He argues that the body isn't just some vehicle for our desires. No, it has a much higher purpose. He paints this incredible picture of the body as a sacred space, a literal temple where God's Spirit lives. This all connects to something called the one flesh principle. The idea here is that sexual intimacy creates this uniquely deep spiritual bond. And the framework suggests that when this union happens outside of a committed marriage covenant, it's like you're fracturing yourself, giving a piece of your soul away without the structure that's meant to protect it. So from the body, we're going to go even deeper into the internal world, to the battle for the mind. This is all about where sin is believed to begin, with lust and with the eye. So how is lust actually defined here? Well, it's not seen as just a random passing thought. It's framed as an active, intentional desire, a covetousness. It's the desire to possess or use another person's body for your own gratification. And this line from the book of Job is just fascinating. It shows this ancient understanding of proactive, personal boundary setting. Job says he's made a covenant with his eyes. This frames the fight against lust not as this passive struggle, but as an active, conscious decision to control what you even allow yourself to look at. The book of James lays out this progression so clearly. It's presented as a kind of cycle. It all starts with lust. That's the conception stage. Then, once that desire is acted on, sin is born. As that sin grows and matures, the text says it ultimately leads to death, which is understood as spiritual separation from God. So lust is seen as the very seed from which all of these other things grow. All right, now we have to turn to a pretty complex and frankly often debated topic, what the source material calls a theology of design, which focuses on behaviors described as being contrary to nature. A key Greek word here, and one that is highly debated by scholars, is arsenokoitai. It appears in some of the lists of sins in the New Testament. Now, its precise meaning is a subject of intense academic debate today, but it has traditionally been interpreted to refer to sexual practices that were seen as going against a so-called natural order. So, the core argument being presented in these biblical letters is one from design. This theological viewpoint basically holds that sexual expression is intended to mirror what it sees as the original pattern of creation, the one laid out right at the beginning in the book of Genesis. So, where does this argument come from? Well, it's built on a few specific ideas from that Genesis creation story. First, that human union is meant to reflect the image of God. And second, that this reflection is specifically achieved through the joining of what are viewed as two distinct but complementary parts of humanity, male and female. Okay, finally, let's look at the cycle of impurity. This is where the texts make a really interesting link, connecting sexual sin to a totally different concept, greed. This quote from Ephesians paints a really vivid picture. It describes people giving themselves over to sensuality, which leads to indulging in all kinds of impurity, all driven by a continual lust for more. That's the key phrase, that feeling of never, ever being satisfied. And this really highlights what the text portrays as the addictive nature of impurity. The view is that it's never static. It always demands more and more intensity. The ultimate end of this cycle is described as a seared conscience, basically a state where a person's moral compass just becomes numb to their own actions. So we've walked through the internal logic of this ancient framework. But this all leaves us with a pretty big question for our own time. In a largely secular world, how do these powerful ancient ideas about covenants and temples and design still shape our culture? Whether we agree with them or not, what is their lasting impact, for better or for worse, on our relationships and even on how we see ourselves? That is definitely something worth thinking about.